The biggest thing that they miss is that mostly Washington views China through a military lens. Yet relations with China are probably military's least important. Far more important is diplomatic, economic, social, institutional. And we just don't seem to be focusing on those things.
I'm Steve Orlins, president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by David Kang, a professor at University of Southern California, quite far from here, but closer than China is from here, who has written a fascinating article along with two co-authors, which is called What China Wants. And what we'll talk about today is how that article differs from the consensus opinion on what China wants and its policy implications, which are very, very serious for the community. So, Professor Kang, tell me, what made you write this article initially?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I mean, I think what the committee does is incredibly important. So it's a delight to be invited. So thank you. The background to this article started, 5, 10 years ago, just as I saw the consensus. There used to be a healthy debate in DC, and then I saw more and more consensus coming towards what you might call the hawk or the China threat, the pessimistic view of China. And in many ways, I thought they were missing what China really does want and what they're actually trying to do. And so I started writing an article based on that. And then I have two younger co-authors. One is my own former advisee, Jackie, and then a good friend of ours, Zenobia, who are doing similar work on Chinese rhetoric. And it made sense for us all to come together to write a piece, which is basically what we want to be as a sort of overview of how to think about what China wants and how to interpret sort of Chinese text in a way.
Was there a particular event that occurred 10 years ago that provoked this, or is it just a gradual realization that this consensus is not consistent with your view?
Yeah, no, there's no particular incident per se. But whereas if you went to you started to hear things about a Pacific pivot, even under Obama, having to contain China, more troops and military assets to the region, way less discussion about economic relations. And so over time, it just became clear that there was a need truly for a wider debate in Washington, D.C. than we currently have.
What does the consensus get wrong?
I think in general, the consensus, the biggest thing that what we call, the DC blob, right? The general consensus, and this is on the left and the right. This is from Biden administration appointees and Trump appointees. The biggest thing that they miss is that mostly Washington views China through a military lens. And we are focused on deterring a Chinese invasion of the Philippines or things that are extremely unlikely. And the only way we talk about Taiwan is in terms of a war. Yet relations with China are probably military's least important. Far more important is diplomatic, economic, social, institutional. And we just don't seem to be focusing on those things.
The article argues that China is internally focused, and it's not a threat to the outer, it's not a threat outside of its immediate vicinity. It's not a threat to the US. It's not a threat to Europe, etc. But Taiwan, it is a threat to Taiwan. So how do we deter Chinese behavior on Taiwan, towards Taiwan?
No, that's a very good characterization. What we've said is that the discussion about China's increasing ambitions and literally there are people in the Trump administration right now who have written that China would probably like to invade the Philippines. And we see no evidence of that at all, or invading Vietnam or Eurasia. China is concerned about its borders, its near region, and things that it's cared about. The most important issue there is Taiwan. Taiwan in this way is different from all the other countries in the region Because although we on the outside look at Taiwan and call it a nation state, the Chinese look at it and say this is part of our sovereign territory. And that's never been in question up until the last 30 years or so. And so for them, it is a very different type of issue than we think that it is. In that sense, deterring military uh, uh, moves on by China is also probably the least of the important things to do on managing what has happened with Taiwan. If we want to preserve peace and stability over Taiwan, it's not going to be stable if we just have a military forces. This is a diplomatic, economic relationship as much as it is military, and it depends as much on what Taiwan does as what China does.
But when China does something like the reunification law, the saying that we need to be prepared in 2000 by 2027 to retake Taiwan. They're not saying we're going to do it, but we need to be prepared. How do you think we should be responding, and how do you think we should respond, and how does that affect your view that China is not a military threat?
Yeah. They reserve the right, China reserves the right to use force. There's no question about it. And much of these types of laws and the military preparations are exactly what we call a costly signal or a signal to the rest of the world that they will use force if they need to. There's no question about it. And part of the reason that, for example, the United States is cautious is that we believe that they will use force. So all sides are very careful about how to deal with Taiwan. The issue, though, is that this is not a Chinese set of preparations in isolation from what Taiwan and the United States are doing. And it is here where we find a really difficult kind of situation. The Taiwanese never talked about independence up until it was democracy 30 years ago in 1996 or so. Before you couldn't do it. It was unthinkable. But with democracy in Taiwan, people can vote and they can elect leaders who are going to say we should be independent. And that's what's happened. And the Chinese have said, you can basically, the deal so far has been the Chinese have said, you can act like an independent country, Taiwan. You can have your own government, you can have your own currency, you can be a capitalist, you can be democracy, just don't formally call yourself independent. As long as that goes on, then I don't see any reason that China would use force. That consensus, what the United States has said to China is, we don't even necessarily agree with your one China policy, but we see you have a one China. We acknowledge you have a one China policy. Just don't use force to change the status quo. And Taiwan, don't you declare formal independence. That status quo, where we all don't agree but we all understand where each other's coming from, has been spectacularly successful. For the last 40 or 50 years, it has, first of all, deterred war. Taiwan has become rich and a democracy. China has become rich, and Americans have been able to trade with both countries, and nobody got killed. That's a really good diplomatic outcome. Why anybody would upend that to me is surprising. Yet often I think that push to change the status quo is not coming from China, but is coming from either Taiwan or the United States. And so there's very much an action reaction here, of which military is one element, but it is not the first element.
How does the article deals with the South China Seas and China's behavior in the South China Seas. How does that fit into your thesis, and how does the arbitral tribunal's decision that China actions in the South China Sea were inconsistent with international law? How does that all fit in?
That's an interesting aspect, right? The South China Seas, in some ways, have always been secondary to Taiwan for the mainland. They're an issue. All sides, including Vietnam, the Philippines, and Taiwan, have been reclaiming land and militarizing the islands, in addition to China. Part of the problem with the South China Sea comes from the fact that nobody can agree on how to handle it. So everybody is reclaiming land. Everybody is militarizing their islands. What the Chinese have said is, we will not use force on that. There's a lot of gray zone tactics and everything else. Those are different fundamentally than questioning the right of a country to exist. which is the Taiwan case, and that China doesn't deny the right for the Philippines or Vietnam to exist. So this is a residual border dispute that is very different from the Taiwan issue or a claim that we are going to invade Vietnam. And one of the points we make in the article is, and this is often overlooked, is that Taiwan makes the identical claims to the South China Seas that does the PRC. This is not a Chinese or PRC, this is not a PRC problem. Taiwan actually has gone farther by passing in the Legislative Yuan in 1998 and 99 a map that says all the islands within the 9-dash line, the U-shaped line, are Taiwanese. So solving this is not simply a matter of China being stubborn and everyone else being willing to solve the problems. The problems are there, and all countries have overlapping claims. And so, yes, China shouldn't use force to do that. But in the wake of the arbitral claims or the arbitrage the Hague in 2016, it was Taiwan that sent a warship through those disputed islands, saying we're going to make sure we show that there are islands. So this is incredibly complicated. But as I say, this is a problem for all the countries, and it's not as if everyone else would solve it, and China's the only problem.
The militarization that has occurred, I would not compare the militarization of the other claimants to China's militarization of those islands. I mean, China's militarization, they have created serious bases there.
Yes.
You know, I've seen innumerable aerial photographs which show what they've created versus, you know, the Philippines, the Malaysians, the Vietnam, I mean, tiny little nothings. So what I noticed, and I've made this point to the Chinese government repeatedly, is when China, and it was during the Obama administration, chose to militarize those islands, people who shared what in the US government, who shared the view that you articulate in this government, retreated, that they didn't advocate for your view, and that when China militarized those islands, your view lost to the consensus. There was a small group that would argue it, but that militarization had an enormous impact on the consensus, which you discuss.
Yes.
Why do you think the consensus got it wrong? I mean, you're quite explicit that it's wrong.
Yeah.
Why do you think it got it wrong?
You're closer to DC than I am, as you said, right? I mean, one reason I like to live in LA is that I'm 3,000 miles away. But I'll say a couple of things. I think the first one is that in general, for American foreign policy, we tend to have a jaw first, military first view of things. Over the years, this is what we're doing. We're going to force other countries to democratize, with our military. And in many ways, I think this is a mistake. We have militarized our foreign policy to the extent that we start with it everywhere instead of that being the last resort. And to that end, we miss all the other ways that we can approach and interact with countries. Because fundamentally, for example, in the South China Sea, it's not going to be a military solution that is stable. There will have to be some kind of negotiated, institutional, diplomatic way in which we all sit down. And the United States isn't even involved. The countries of the region sit down and say, let's figure out something that works. And I think the DC consensus has fallen back on an easy China threat because it is easy and it makes sense to most Americans. China's big, it's communist, it must be threatening. But I think we forego, and to our detriment, we forego the other elements of foreign relations that would help to moderate our relationship or to manage our relationship with China.
Why does, there's all these articles about China interfering in the US, interfering in local elections. If they don't have aspirations to be the global superpower, why do they do that?
Yeah. There definitely is Chinese interference in the United States. The consulates get involved, they interfere around the world. That's absolutely true. These are issues. These are absolutely issues. We know that Chinese companies will steal data and will steal technology. It is very hard to work as a foreign company in Chinese business, as we all know, right? These are all major issues. The point of our article is that military is probably not the best way to solve almost any of these. That's the main point. Yet that's where we start with everything. The second point, to get back more to your direct question, what we found is so interesting about the Belt and Road Initiative. And so I'm going to switch a little bit here. But there's a lot of talk of China trying to have influence over countries by buying through their Belt and Road Initiative. Zenobia's research has shown pretty clearly that this attempt to buy and influence countries is focused mostly on consent or acceptance of Chinese goals, such as Taiwan. It's not an attempt to influence the countries on what they're doing. It's an attempt to get those countries to agree to Chinese, again, mostly domestic or internal issues. So it's influence operations and it's influence in a different way, whereas the United States often tries to get countries to accept our values. One of the things we point out is that this phrase, Chinese characteristics, is more than a phrase. It's about China that they're concerned about, and they're trying to make sure that other countries aren't bothering China.
If you had interviewed me during your writing of the article, I would have told you a story, which again, I think the Chinese share your viewpoint, but the National Security Advisor of China, who's at this point in time was a good friend, he said, Steve, you're missing a fundamental point. At this point, Hu Jintao was president, and Obama was president. No, Bush was president, actually. And he said, so Bush gets up in the morning and he gets his national security briefing. He hears about Afghanistan, Iraq, Venezuela. The threats to the U.S. are perceived as external. He said, Hu Jintao gets up in the morning and he gets briefed on Sichuan, on Xizang, on Xinjiang, on our threats are all perceived as internal. And if you don't understand the first hour of your president's day, you don't understand it. And that would support, clearly he was supporting your argument. One last question, and the policy implications of the article are enormous. I mean, if you agree with it, you adopt a different policy. If you don't, you kind of stay with the policy that we currently have. Talk about those specifically, what the policy implications are.
This is one of the reasons that we wrote the paper we did, and we actually have a follow-on paper that is explicitly getting into the policy implications, precisely because they're enormous and they're important for the United States. If we get China right, we will have a better policy, in one that'll be cheaper and less prone to getting us caught in a war, right? So the first one is, if China is more internally focused than externally, and if they are more status quo than revisionist, then the need for a generations-long militarization of the Western Pacific in order to deter them is a waste of money. And we're finding we're having difficulties doing that anyway with the US military. Whether we can have a 300 ship Navy and how we're going to get all those assets over there. Can we actually continue to have primacy all the way to the Western Pacific? If there's not a need to have one, it has enormous implications for the US military footprint and spending. Beyond that, if there isn't a need for a deterrence of China, the United States is missing out on what's going on in the region, because most of the other countries in the region are preparing to live or prepared to live with a big China. Nobody's moving away. Koreans have to live with China. Vietnam has to live with China. And if that's not simply deterring a Chinese invasion, the United States needs to be involved in economic relations, which are rapidly moving forward, regional multilateralism, all of these issues that Chinese, as you said, like when you wake up in the morning, when Korean or Philippine or Malaysian leaders wake up in the morning, or elites wake up in the morning, they're not worried about a Chinese invasion, but they're worried about trade, investment, drug running, immigration. And the United States is not engaging in those issues, and it is harming the United States by not being involved that way.
Yeah. There's no question, I think, that bad US-China relations impact the United States and China, and it impacts people, interestingly, at a lower income level.
Mm-hmm.
That it's, So we don't fix our infrastructure because we're spending money on the military. The Chinese don't have a social safety net because they're spending money on the military. So the real losers in that are actually lower income Americans and lower income Chinese. I think the question is, so how do you fix the relationship that you can then spend money on the real priorities of the people?
Can I make one final comment? Because I think that's absolutely true. And this is where I think West Coast has a very different view of Asia than does the East Coast. BYD, the Chinese maker, a couple of years ago, they had 500, we were employing 500 Americans in Los Angeles as we converted buses from gas to electronic.
Yeah.
It's incredible. It's awesome. Believe me, living in LA, less pollution would be great. And that is in danger because of all the other histrionics. So yes, there's problems with Chinese business, there's problems, but there's so many avenues for good cooperation that we are foregoing, and that is a loss to the United States, to the region.
Is that facility still operating?
I think it's under threat. I haven't checked recently, but a couple of years ago there was real pressure on it because it was BYD in the United States.
Thank you very much for this interview. Thank you very much for writing the article. I think it's a must read, whether you agree with it or whether you don't agree with it. It should form the basis for a discussion in the policy community of what China really wants and what the policies that the United States should adopt. But thank you so much for writing. I know we don't have your co-authors, but I thank them too.
Thank you so much for having me, and on behalf of Jackie and Zenobia, who were just as much a part of this as me, thank you so much.
Thanks.